Welcome to another explainer. You know, when we analyze international conflicts, the view from the top almost always looks completely different from the reality on the ground. And today, we've got a fascinating task ahead of us. We're going to impartially break down two very different but deeply connected Palestinian source documents. By putting these texts side by side, we get this incredibly unique dual-lens perspective. One is looking from the top down at international geopolitics, and the other is looking from the ground up at granular human rights data. It's like looking at two completely different pieces of the exact same puzzle. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start by introducing our two source documents. Then we'll examine the push for UN membership. After that, we'll transition from that macro-level international diplomacy down to the ground level, covering international law, analyzing some casualty data, and looking at the psychological impacts. Finally, we'll wrap up with the documented calls to action. Let's get started. Section 1. Two distinct source documents. Exploring the primary texts. So, here's our very first primary source. This is the cover of Iraq Palestina, which translates to Palestinian Papers. Specifically, we're looking at issue 30 from the summer of 2022. This is a quarterly magazine published by the Yasser Arafat Foundation, and it gives us a really high-level strategic view of things. The specific editorial we're pulling from this issue focuses heavily on the Palestinian Authority's political and diplomatic maneuvers on the world stage. And this brilliantly illustrates the stark contrast between our sources. The 2022 Iraq Palestina editorial is entirely focused on geopolitical strategy, things like United Nations membership and shifting international alliances. But then, on the flip side, we have our second source. It's an English-language report from the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, or PCHR, covering June 2007 to June 2008. This one is heavily data-driven. It zeroes in on exhaustive statistical breakdowns, legal frameworks, and some pretty harrowing eyewitness testimonies regarding child casualties in the Gaza Strip. So they differ fundamentally in scope, but they're both reflecting different facets of the exact same overarching situation. Moving on to Section 2, the UN membership push, the diplomatic battle for recognition. Let's move to and see how this builds over time, because the push for international recognition detailed in that 2022 editorial absolutely didn't happen overnight. Looking at the timeline, in September 2011, President Mahmoud Abbas submitted the initial request for full UN membership. Then, by November 2012, they hit a significant milestone. The UN General Assembly granted Palestine non-member observer state status, which was a major diplomatic and legal win. Building on that momentum, in September 2015, the Palestinian flag was officially raised at the UN headquarters. Fast forward to August 2022, when this editorial was published, and we see a renewed, concerted push for full, official UN membership. But as the editorial points out, this membership bid doesn't just exist in a vacuum, right? It's happening against a highly complex geopolitical backdrop. The authors anticipated a U.S. veto at the UN Security Council, acknowledging that immediate diplomatic hurdle. But beyond that, they point to a whole web of global turbulence complicating their efforts. We're talking about the Russia-Ukraine war and Europe's alignment, rising tensions between the U.S. and China over Taiwan, and the resulting global energy and gas crises. On top of all that, the editorial notes strong Israeli opposition and regional lobbying efforts. So the big takeaway here is that Palestinian diplomacy is deeply entangled in and directly impacted by these major global conflicts. All right, Section 3. International Law and Protection, Framing the Human Rights Baseline. Now, to really understand our second source document, the PCHR report, we need to shift our focus away from the macro-level diplomacy of the UN down to the actual framework of international law. The legal baseline this report uses to document alleged violations relies heavily on the Fourth Geneva Convention. Basically, this is an international treaty that provides general protection for civilians who are taking no part in hostilities. It strictly demands humane treatment and expressly forbids collective penalties, coercion, and reprisals. For the PCHR, this specific treaty, along with the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, forms the non-negotiable standard they use to evaluate the realities on the ground in the occupied Palestinian territory. Section 4. Analyzing the casualty data, quantifying the ground realities. Because the PCHR report is incredibly data-dense, we're going to slow our pace down a bit here out of respect and look at the realities quantified between 2000 and 2008. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the geographic breakdown. The data tracks a heavy concentration of child fatalities caused by Israeli occupation forces in border areas. Rafah saw the highest number, with 191 fatalities. The northern Gaza Strip documented 114. Khan Yunis recorded 51,
the central Gaza Strip 36, and Gaza City saw 60. According to the PCHR data, that brings the total number of children killed across all regions of the Gaza Strip to 548 during this 8-year span.
Zooming in on a specific 12-month period from June 2007 to June 2008, the report states that 68 children were killed in the Gaza Strip. When we look at the specific methods of force documented during that single year, the breakdown shows 57% of those fatalities were caused by missiles. Another 27% were the result of gunshot wounds, and 16% were caused by tank shells. The PCR uses this specific data set to argue that advanced military technology is being utilized in densely populated areas.
Section 5, Testimonies and Psychological Impact. The human stories behind the data. The PCHR report doesn't just stick to numbers, though. It dedicates a huge amount of space to qualitative eyewitness accounts. One meticulously documented incident is the death of 12-year-old Safa Abu Saif during an incursion in Jabalia known as Operation Winter Heat. Her family's testimony, exactly as recorded by the center, details a really harrowing sequence. First, the family of 25 sheltered together in their living room. Second, Safa stepped outside to use an exterior staircase to warn relatives up on the second floor. Third, the family reported hearing a single gunshot, which fatally wounded Safa in the chest. And finally, step 4, the family testified that ambulance access was delayed due to the presence of tanks, forcing them to rely on phone advice from the Red Crescent. Tragically, Safa bled to death 3 hours later.
There's another highly detailed timeline in the report that pieces together the events of April 16, 2008 at Juhar al-Dik. At 4 a.m., an incursion into the village began. Later that afternoon at 16:30, missiles struck, killing 16-year-old Islam al-Isawi and several other children. Half an hour later, at 1700, Reuters journalists, including cameraman Fadel Shana, arrived to document the aftermath. Shortly after they arrived, the report details that a tank shell struck the Reuters vehicle, killing Shana and 2 local youth standing nearby. The report pieces together these witness accounts to build a sequenced timeline, arguing against the targeted use of force on unarmed civilians and journalists.
Beyond the physical toll, the report also focuses heavily on the secondary, psychological impacts on survivors. They cite a study by Dr. Abdel Aziz Musa Thabet on collective trauma, which found that an astonishing 70.1% of children in the surveyed areas showed symptoms of PTSD. Looking at the specifics, the most common reactions documented were insomnia at 40.5%, nervousness at 39%, and another 39% exhibiting behaviors associated with trying to erase painful memories. The center frames this collective psychological trauma as a direct, ongoing result of the hostilities.
Section 6. Documented calls to action. Demands from the PCR. So the crucial point is how the PCHR actually translates all this ground-level data into international demands. Based on their findings, they outline a few very specific recommendations. First, they demand the establishment of an independent investigation committee that meets international standards. Second, they urge global organizations to prioritize stopping child killings globally. Third, they call upon Israel to fulfill its obligations under the Fourth Geneva Convention and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And finally, they demand that the high contracting parties to the Geneva Convention actively search for and prosecute those responsible for what the PCHR categorizes as war crimes. Which leaves us with this final thought. We started out today with the Awadic Philistinia editorial focusing on high-level statecraft, global alliances, and the strategic push for full UN membership. Then we ended with the PCHR report, filled with statistics, strict legal frameworks, and tragic eyewitness accounts of civilian casualties right there on the ground. So here's the question. How does the granular documentation of localized human rights violations actually influence that high-level diplomatic push for UN recognition? How do the realities faced by individuals shape the strategies debated in the halls of the United Nations? It's an incredibly complex intersection of human reality and international geopolitics, but understanding both of these source documents gives us a much clearer picture of the whole situation. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep asking the big questions.